In episode 3, we talked about how we learn to interact with other people from the people and cultures we grew up with. The same is true for Mirabel Madrigal, the hero of Encanto. In the family Madrigal, Abuela, the family matriarch, has the final say on everything, like how holidays are celebrated, who her granddaughters marry, and who's allowed to talk about Bruno. Spoiler alert, no one talks about Bruno. And because Mirabel grew up in Colombia, her family's values are also influenced by the culture of the society she grew up in. Colombian culture really values close-knit family connections, and it's common for multiple generations to live together in one home, like in Mirabel's casita. And in most parts of Colombia, respecting older community members is really important, which is why the Madrigals look to Abuela as their leader. Mirabel's family accepts that Abuelas have more power in family culture than younger family members in the family they live in, which is why what Abuela says goes. And while we don't live in magical houses, we all have something in common with Mirabel's family. Like the Madrigals, our perception of who has power and why they have power is shaped by the values of the cultures and societies we live in. And those values trickle down into our everyday communities, like our families and workplaces. And they affect our behavior and how we interact with other people. Hi, I'm Cassandra Ryder, and this is Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication. First, we need to understand the concept of power. Dutch social psychologist Geert Hofstede defines power as the extent to which people are able to influence the ideas and behaviors of others. So for instance, a parent has more power than a child because parents influence their children's choices, like which veggies they eat and when bedtime is. According to Hofstede, the power people have is heavily influenced by the culture of the nation they grew up in. That's because a person's country is probably the largest and most powerful cultural group they're a part of. And because of that, our nation's cultural values also influence the values and behaviors of other institutions and organizations that people participate in too. Here's what we mean. Let's say you grew up in a fictional nation called Beaumont that is totally against dancing. Beaumont shows its anti-dancing values by passing laws that outlaw dancing in any public place, including proms, flash mobs, and swing dancing classes. In Beaumont, doing the robot can get you thrown in jail. And Beaumont's no dancing ever values trickle down from the national level into other institutions and organizations within your country. For instance, families in Beaumont show that they support anti-dancing attitudes by banning all books and movies that mention dancing from their homes. Workplaces even fire employees who get caught bobbing their heads to the elevator music. Beaumont shows us how a nation's cultural values can influence how other institutions and people behave. And it also shows us how those values influence power dynamics. In this case, the nation has the most power because it exerts the most influence over individuals and institutions, which is why Beaumont is a no-hip wiggle zone. But Hofstede also wanted to explain how members of societies feel about how power is distributed within their nation and communities. And to do that, he created a concept called power distance. I know, that sounds like a yoga pose. But power distance is actually a tool for measuring how much the less powerful members of a society accept the imbalance of power, or inequality they experience. Every culture and individual experiences power distance because there's inequality in every society. Bummer, I know. Inequality exists because of the ways that societies group and categorize people. We use categories like gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and class to sort people into different categories. In Mirabel's case, her society would categorize her as young, female, and Latina, and she's assigned a degree of power based on these categories. So for instance, Mirabel has less power because of how young she is. The amount of power Mirabel has then influences her interactions with other members of her society and community. Grouping people into categories like this becomes a problem because societies prioritize some groups over others. Like, Beaumont places more value on people who are anti-dancing over those who aren't, and Mirabel's family prioritizes the views of older members of her family over younger ones. And according to the concept of power distance, the people in society who experience more inequality are going to show a certain level of acceptance of that power imbalance. Like, maybe the pro-dancers of Beaumont think that they're being treated unfairly, which means that they have a low acceptance of their power distance, which is why they, along with the help of Kevin Bacon, protest and win the right to have school dances. But in Mirabel's family, everyone pretty much accepts that Abuela has more power than everyone else, meaning they have a higher acceptance of their power distance. And according to Hofstede, the attitude that members of a society have towards the distribution of power depends on what type of power distance their society endorses. To explain this idea, Hofstede defines two types of power distance cultures: high power distance cultures, and low power distance cultures. The category that a country falls into depends on how accepting its less powerful citizens are of the distribution of power within their society. For instance, in a high power distance culture, the level of inequality that's endorsed by a nation's leaders is also supported by its followers. And high power distance cultures usually exhibit a high degree of inequality. According to Hofstede's research, countries like Thailand, India, China, and Colombia are examples of high power distance cultures. The degree of inequality we see in these cultures trickles down into smaller institutions and organizations without much pushback from its members. Members of a high power distance culture also accept that there's a strict social hierarchy. In Mirabelle's family, elderly family members are placed at the top of the social hierarchy, and younger family members are at the bottom. And everyone is pretty much good with that. That's partially because high power distance cultures are really unlikely to change how they're structured. Like, a nation's military isn't going to change up its social structure just because soldiers don't like having less power than the officers. High power distance cultures run on a strict chain of command that all members of society are expected to follow without complaining. And if someone does complain, they'll probably be disciplined. And that can be as minor as getting a warning or as serious as ending up in jail. But there are also privileges that come with your place in a high power distance culture, depending on what group you fall into. Like, powerful people probably have wealth and status, and they might be exempt from the restrictions that apply to less powerful members. At the bottom of the hierarchy, less powerful citizens might receive social benefits like free education or housing, which is designed to keep them from becoming dissatisfied with their power distance. So to recap, members of high power distance cultures generally accept that there's a high degree of inequality in their society, and because of that, they follow their society's preferences for how members at every level of the social hierarchy should behave. And then there are low power distance cultures. In low power distance cultures, both leaders and members believe in the fair and equitable sharing of power among members. According to Hofstede's research, Sweden, Denmark, Costa Rica, and the United States are all examples of low power distance cultures. For instance, Sweden values equality and individualism, which are the types of cultural values we'd expect to see in low power distance cultures. These values are baked into societal norms, which affects how every citizen views power and equality. And those social norms shape the way that people from Sweden communicate with each other and with people from other cultures. So we know the key differences between high power distance and low power distance cultures. But Hofstede also tells us that there can be a lot of variety in how high and low power distance cultures look. Like, Sweden and the United States may both be low power distance cultures, but they are definitely not the same. To understand the differences between cultures that fall into the same power distance category, we can look at other values that a nation endorses. For instance, Hofstede points out that US culture really values independence, in addition to the core low power distance values of fairness and equality. Like, while US culture tends to be pretty open and informal, it's also loosely knit because it values independence. So that means that families and individuals are expected to take care of themselves without relying on support from institutions like the government. But other low-power distance countries don't value independence as highly. Like, Sweden and Denmark provide more government support to all members of society. So we see how two countries can have a low-power distance culture, but put those values in practice in totally different ways. And of course, that doesn't mean that low power distance cultures are perfect. Inequality is hard baked into all societies. Low power distance cultures are no different. That's why the US can value equality and justice and still struggle with issues like racism, social inequality, and injustice. At the end of the day, high and low power distance cultures are different. Members of high and low power distance cultures have different expectations for how power and inequality are distributed in their lives. And their attitudes towards power and inequality affect the way they behave in their relationships and communities. But there can also be differences in how power distance values play out within a high or low power distance culture. Like, just because the majority of members of a society endorse their culture's distribution of power doesn't mean that all members of that culture feel the same way. We're most likely to see variation in how members behave in low power distance cultures, since they tend to be more open to displays of independent thinking from less powerful members. Take college, for instance. College professors who buy into low power distance values may ask students to call them by their first names and let students suggest different topics to study. But other college professors in the US may lean towards high power distance values. They might require students to refer to them as doctor or professor and have stricter classroom policies. So even though the power dynamics of lots of organizations are influenced by their nation's values, there's still variation in how different communities put those values into practice. Because people are unique, creative, and always growing and changing. And that's a good thing. Understanding the concept of power distance helps explain why power is distributed in certain ways in our communities and relationships. And understanding how members of our cultural groups feel about power can explain why people behave in certain ways at home, at work, online, and in the community. Power distance also gives us clues about what people who aren't from our cultural groups may expect and accept where power and inequality are concerned. Whether you're interacting with a classmate, a coworker, or a family from Colombia that lives in a magical casita, understanding that our experiences with power and inequality influence how we treat others can help us make stronger connections across cultural boundaries. But maybe don't mention Bruno anyway, just to be safe. Thanks for watching Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication, which is part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time!